And then we will move into the heart of the session, which is to call upon the research team to share some of the detail of the findings, beginning with context, then moving around values and purpose before coming on to skills and competencies. So 3 sections. We'll then have a short Q&A at the end before we share some thanks and the close of the session. So that's the shape of things this afternoon, or whatever time zone you're in. So broadly speaking, to share, to listen, to reflect and respond. That's the thematic shape of the engagement. Some housekeeping. Please do mute your audio and turn off video. It just helps with the bandwidth considerations. In terms of your name, it'd be lovely to have your names in your Zoom screens. And if you need to change your name, the 3 little dots in the corner, click on those and you can rename just in case your Zoom account has an organizational name or something like that. So please do change that. We're going to monitor closely the chat window. Please do use that to share reflections, observations, and questions. Now, if you have a question, can you put a capital Q before it so that I can easily pick it out in terms of thinking about the Q&A later. We are recording this session, and I noticed the recording has started already, so the session will be recorded, and one or more of the events will be shared online or an edited collection, as it were. Live transcription is available, so if that's helpful to you, do click on that in the options bar on Zoom. Just for reassurance in terms of the live polling, no individual will be identified from the live polling results. They'll be drawn together and aggregated and presented as a collective set of results. And should you have any technical difficulties as the session progresses along, do drop a message to the Advanced HE team, and they'll do everything they can to help you from behind the scenes, as it were. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping there. Okay, the Global Leadership Survey and Framework. Well, working with the sector. So our philosophy for this from the outset has to be to work with the sector in a process of co-creation around both the survey and the framework. And really, I mean, what do we say? The extraordinary events of the last couple of years have really brought into sharp focus that question: what works for leadership in higher education? And we have certainly seen some things that have worked amazingly at different stages of the pandemic landscape, and we have seen other things that perhaps have worked less well. And it is a key part of Advanced HE's overall strategy to develop and produce for the sector a global framework for leadership in higher education and related organisations. And just a little bit of text from our Chief Executive, Alison Johns. This whole process should be one of the largest collective conversations about leadership in higher education that there has been. So those are some of our ambitions and the aims of the survey itself. Well, one key aim is to think about what underpins, what legitimizes a framework. And so the survey we see as a key part of this. But to start to generate a unique evidence base, to add to our understanding of how colleagues in higher education actually conceive of leadership. And it can be quite a contested area. To help to articulate values, behaviours and constructs that contribute towards effective or good leadership. Different roles, different levels, part of that. To highlight contextual variations, both within the sector and around the world. To contrast the views of those leading and those being led. And we all have a kind of dual capacity when it comes to that. To explore the impact of leadership development and to promote the importance of reflective leadership practitioners. So those are the aims of the survey. And to develop the survey, we've engaged a research team to carry out a scoping study. Now, the question, what works for leadership? Without a much clearer understanding, it's extremely difficult to invest in leaders, support leaders, develop leaders, and recognize leadership in a reasonably consistent and reliable way, and crucially, develop that talent for tomorrow. A richer understanding should also inform things to do with organizational design, the composition of leadership teams, and also some of their structures and underpinning values. So the need is there. Okay, so just to begin our engagement with the live polling, here's the first one for you. What are you looking forward to in this session? And you can select one or two of these 7 options. So the link is there, and I'll just invite Katie to post that in the chat once again, just to refresh that for you. And we have some responses already, some people very hot off the mark with this, which is wonderful. Okay. Fantastic. Always gives me a childish delight to see the movement in real time of the poll on the screen. Okay, so clearly wanting to hear some of those initial research findings, a key part of the dissemination aspect of this. Reflections on the context, some specific skills and qualities being emphasized, the opportunity to interact with the findings, and of course, throughout, the opportunity to reflect around our own leadership, identity, and practice. Excellent. Well, thank you. So I hope you've connected to the polling with ease, a second screen, a browser, a tablet, a phone, whatever you like. And as I say, once you're in, you're in. Each poll will activate automatically as we come to it. Fabulous. Thank you very much. Okay, so a little bit about the scoping study itself and the journey. So commissioned in June 2021, and we had a public launch in August. 2 parts to the scoping study, a literature review and a series of roundtable discussions. The literature review commenced straight away, and the roundtables took place between October and December, 11 in total. Since the last of the roundtables, the process of thematic analysis of the data has been underway, and that's led to where we are today with these dissemination and engagement events. Some of the responses from the polls that we do on these events will be folded back in, as it were, into that process of analysis as we work towards the initial survey design, with the survey itself being launched and run before the end of this academic year, so before the end of July 2022. So that's the timeline we're on in terms of the journey overall. So in terms of the team, we have Professor Richard Watermeyer, Professor Richard Bolden, and Dr. Catherine Knight with us in this session, which is wonderful. They will introduce themselves as they pick up each session. And we also, in the research team, have Professor Bruce McFarlane, who's not with us. Bruce is with the Education University of Hong Kong at the moment, but he's been a key part of the research, particularly around the literature review aspect. Okay, so with regard to the literature review, just to give you a flavour of that, looking back really over a span of 30 years, a range of disciplines, education, sociology, psychology, organisational studies and others, selected clearly for their relevance to higher education, with intentionally an international focus and spanning the range of communities within the higher education environment. So far, over 200 citations. The literature review continues, but the bulk of the work is done. Okay. And then 3 perspectives that came out of the literature review. Broadly speaking, the traditionalist perspective, thinking about the cultural context of higher education, a reformist perspective with a focus on values and purpose in particular, and then a pragmatist perspective within the literature, thinking about the skills and competencies that contribute towards good or effective leadership. And those three perspectives we used as the structure for the roundtable discussions, and will also be the broad headings of what we share with you during this session. The roundtables, 11 in total, just to give you a feel of those, we looked to draw upon segments of our community in the broadest and most representative way we could. So from early career academics through to members of senior executive groups, professional service leaders, people representing professional and representative and funding bodies supporting the sector, and those in roles to do with staff and organizational development as well. So a range of segments represented to draw together in a representative way, as far as we could, the entire higher education community. Overall, 113 participants from 96 organizations across 20 country settings, and you can see some of the countries listed there. And in terms of the diversity within the groups, we used an expression of interest process to help to ensure representative and social diversity within the groups as well. Okay. So just to give you a flavour and take you into those roundtables, I'm really delighted to have with us Regina Everett and Lee Hilpert, just to speak, as I say, for 6 or 7 minutes, firstly about their experience of the roundtable, and then secondly, to do with the value of the survey and the potential utility of a framework in the future. So can I come to Regina first, please? So I will stop sharing at this point and welcome Regina to the microphone. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the opportunity to share my reflections on the roundtable discussion. So again, I'm Regina Everett. I'm Assistant Chief Operating Officer for Services and the Director of Library, Archives, and Learning Services at the University of East London. I attended the roundtable discussion in my capacity as a member of SCONAL, which is the Society of College, National, and University Libraries. SCONAL represents all university libraries in the UK and in Ireland, national libraries, and many libraries with collections of national significance. So the organization promotes the role of academic libraries, represents the views of member organizations to government, and provides a range of services such as business intelligence and reciprocal access scheme. But I'm also the chair of the SCONAL BAME, or Global Ethnic Majority Group. And the group was formed in response to a 2019 report commissioned by SCONAL to document the experiences of Black, Asian, and minoritized ethnic staff members in academic libraries. And the report enabled senior leaders to hear the experiences of global ethnic majority staff members in their services and to take action to improve representation, particularly in leadership roles. The experiences shared in the report were unsurprising. Staff members spoke of feelings of isolation and being monitored, as they were often the sole global ethnic majority staff member in the service. They also spoke of feelings of that they were representing all members of ethnic groups and were often called on to lead on issues around race and diversity on top of their day jobs. And a particularly worrying statistic was that 44% of the 273 respondents experienced racism in their services. And of those who reported the abuse, 80% said that they were not satisfied with the outcome. So the conclusion of that report was that change is needed in a variety of areas, of which leadership is a key area. So I am one of 3 that I'm aware of global ethnic majority directors of academic libraries in the UK and Ireland. 3. So in 2015, a chartered library and information professionals and archives and Records Association survey of about 85,000 library and information professionals in the UK found that 97% of respondents identified as white. That statistic is unlikely to have changed much over the last 7 years, and I understand that that survey will be rerun shortly, but it is problematic. And it also mirrors the lack of ethnic diversity and leadership in UK higher education institutions. And yet our student populations are much more diverse. So what does this say to students who see few or no one in senior or executive roles, leadership roles that look like them? Just other areas identified for change in this, the 2019 SCONA report were around sort of voice of staff members, zero tolerance of racism, cultural behavioral change, partnerships for change and career progression. So that's the context of why I took part in the discussion. So my reflections on the roundtable discussions about leaders of the future. Well, certainly the roundtable was international in scope. So, and I learned that the challenges that we face in the UK are similar to those at other institutions around the world. So financial security, particularly post-pandemic, recruitment and retention of students and staff, digital transformation, government policies, partnerships, sustainability, from the environment to inequalities. It seems that leaders need to have the business acumen of an international banker and the values of the humblest of charity workers. Of course, we are charitable organizations, most of us. So we started to unpack what equity and inclusion should look like in our institution, and whether it's the staffing profile or the student profile. We discussed a bit about how global ethnic majority students and staffs are often concentrated in certain types of institutions. Now, time didn't allow us to really unpack that issue, but that was one that we considered. We also considered the spaces and how they engender belonging or othering, inclusive pedagogy amidst the calls to decolonize the curriculum, for example. Now, I have to admit, I drank the Kool-Aid of emotional intelligence, and I believe that the leader sets the tone and the culture for the organization. So if you as a leader do not understand the point of segmented data analysis to understand your degree awarding gap, or you don't allocate any funding to support initiatives to deal with that issue, that tells your people in your organization quite clearly what your priorities are. Now, the value of this global survey for me is to understand the emerging demands of leaders of the future, so that we have the skills that we need to develop the leaders. But we also hope that the outcome will, in addition to talking about technical skills, talk about empathy and self-awareness and humility, especially if you need to do right for past wrongs, for example. Now, I think that input from people who will be led is important, and I'm glad to see that that's a key element of it, because obviously for me, a key question that I ask my direct reports is, how do you like to be managed? So I think that input is really important, and leaders have to take the time to understand the people, behavior, and culture of the organizations that they lead to ensure that their values align. So as development of more diverse leadership in academic libraries is a priority for SCONAL, we will be watching with interest the outcomes of the survey and may, adapt the resultant framework to our development programs. And we've already worked collaboratively with Advanced AG to develop a leadership program on leading change on race equality. And that program provides a safe space for leaders to start to have those difficult discussions and discoveries about how their leadership can help or hinder the development of an environment that fosters equitable opportunities for all students and staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And gosh, that was incredibly rich set of reflections, but also commentary in terms of context. Can't thank you enough, actually. And yes, the emphasis around humility and emotional intelligence rings through strongly. You can't be true to others until you're true to yourself, and that's a really strong part of that. But obviously, self in context as well. That's so powerful. There's actually a request from a colleague in the chat, Regina. Just as to some of the references you've made there, whether you could share those in the chat.
Okay.
If you can, that would be most welcome. If not, I'm sure we can capture them later and share those around. Fantastic. Thank you very, very much indeed. Wonderfully spoken. Let's come to Lee Hilpert next, please.
Thanks, Doug. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Over to you.
It is really hard to be a follow-up act with someone as impressive as Regina. And I kind of just want to say what she said because that was awesome. And I think you'll probably see a little bit of an echo in some of the stuff that's that I've put together, because mine was far less structured. Mine has really been more about that mulling and rambling and reflecting since we had our session with Richard originally. So my name is Lee Hilpert. I'm the Head of Education and Student Experience for the Faculty of Population Health Sciences at University College London. It's a real mouthful, that one. And I've been in education for higher education for far too long, 20 years now, and in a number of settings internationally and in the UK. I came to the Professional Services Leaders Group in October, and Richard kicked us off with asking us what is good leadership, which is an incredibly broad question and could have taken us in any particular avenue. But I think the very first thing was we were all sitting there feeling a bit nervous, and we didn't know each other, but I had to acknowledge the fact that it's so nice to have events like this where we don't just work within our institutions and we have the opportunity to talk to each other across these settings, particularly with the lack of conferences over the last couple of years, but this sort of setting. And we immediately started talking about the pressure of being in leadership in higher education. And specifically the difficulty in driving change. And we quite quickly started talking about some of the nicer characteristics of good leadership. So we talked about being compassionate and empathetic. We talked about kindness and being hard working and being receptive and responsive to the people that we lead. And also encouraging collegiality. So it was really quite a gentle and positive discussion. But then you start drilling down into some of those details, and we started talking about leadership styles, for example. We all expressed a preference for a collaborative approach, but then immediately admitted that we so often work in silos, either in departments or in faculties or within institutions, exactly as I just said at the beginning. We don't always have the opportunity to talk to other colleagues across the UK or internationally. We started thinking, well, it's quite hard. We want to be collaborative, but we have difficulty in being effective in this intention, and it's very hard to have success in this way rewarded. But there's a sense of trying to create some kind of psychological security, trust with the people we lead and with our colleagues who are co-leaders, and sometimes that's easier said than done. So that went on to a conversation about balance and the trickier aspects of leadership. And actually, the more I thought about this after our discussion, the more I imagined a tightrope walker. And particularly that tightrope starts getting quite high, right? It's not the lofty peaks of ivory towers, but rather the tightrope between those ivory towers that we're walking. And then all that we start, that line that we walk can be anything like being human and also inspiring confidence, entertaining self-doubt particularly when we're driving a change process, but also being courageous, juggling different sides of arguments, like being sympathetic to the theoretical ideal, but also knowing what is actually possible, but being both slightly impervious to criticism and also open to constructive criticism. And then always coming down to the fact that we believe it shouldn't be a dictatorship in HE, but also much more diplomatic, requiring negotiation and quite a lot of interpretation between different areas. So I think, and then I think we ended up our conversation talking about effective leadership in large institutions, particularly where we're addressing conflicting values. And the thoughts that I had following on from this discussion were, for me, and this is something I'm interested in anyway, but particularly for professional services staff in leadership roles in universities who exist in this sort of third space. And I know that's a well-known thing, and how we feel like we need to validate ourselves and actually knowing how to value our own worth and our contribution to HE. And how difficult it is to get people working together genuinely as a team with real mutual respect, not just the lip service of mutual respect, but finding ways in which people can bring their expertise to group work where everybody's input is respected and contributes to the final outcome. And I think as a leader, you end up having to manage those sort of multiple streams of input and decide between them. And that's often like Solomon's choice, right? It's hard. And I think we talked a little bit, which made me think about it. We do everything at such a breakneck speed. And I mean, it's been particularly evident over the last couple of years, and being able to be more proactive as leaders. And I think finally, this is more reflections over the past few weeks. I don't know anyone who's an active social media user, but university managers are often very badly vilified in social media. And professional service leaders, there's no sort of defining line what that is. Is it senior management? Is it middle management? Who's a university manager? And people who are genuinely trying to collaborate and effect genuine change are all tarred with the same brush. So I think all of these are just reflections. What I would like to see from the ELSE framework was if it could help us address some of these issues and these discrepancies so that we understand each other better, and that we have the better understanding and skills to navigate these liminal spaces. And that's what I want.
Wow. Round of applause to both yourself, Lee, and Regina. That was tremendous, a tremendous set of reflections, but stimulus also. So much in that for colleagues to absorb. And yeah, I mean, as you've listened to colleagues there, some of these conversations were amongst the richest I've ever experienced in terms of what leadership is in our particular context. That reference to balance, absolutely. Leadership is all about balance, freedom and control, continuity and change, individual and collective. You know, it's balance all the time. And your last point there, Lee, that sense of leaders operating in public all the time, and what that means for a leadership role. Thank you so much. That was absolutely tremendous. Let's move swiftly now into sharing some of the findings themselves and inviting you to engage with them. So as mentioned, we'll use that three perspective structure to present to you the emerging findings. So coming first to Professor Richard Bolden. Hello, Richard, to look at contexts of HE leadership.
Thanks, Doug. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Doug, and actually through to the next one after that as well. Thank you. So yeah, so we began the roundtables really by asking people to reflect on what are the main features of the higher education landscape, so structural, organizational, other sort of factors that impact on leadership within their organization, the professional area. Doug, I'm going to ask you to click through next. So as you can imagine, sort of, I guess, front and center, well, significant in many of the conversations was a discussion around the pandemic, and particularly around the volatility, complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity that had kind of thrown up. And I think it's touched on in the opening comments by Regina and Lee as well, around, you know, speed, crisis management, all of these sorts of things. What was described previously as VUCA, which was a concept developed by the US Army College in the 1970s to describe the post-war, post-Cold War environment, but actually increasingly used and relevant to organizations. I think certainly describes many people's experience in higher education through that point. But I guess what sat behind that, and what many people have said really, was that the pandemic had thrown actually into stark contrast a number of issues that have been affecting the sector for far longer, and more significant issues. So again, the points that Lee mentioned really around the need to balance and these different competing agendas. So something about sort of funding and what that means for the marketization and competition in higher education, political forces. So, you know, this a sense, particularly in the UK and Australia, but also in some of the other countries, around a kind of critique from politicians and government around kind of the role and function of universities, and growing regulation and metrics around which they need to compete. Shifting social expectations. So we saw an interesting tension in the pandemic about both a kind of real recognition of the role of universities in sort of in the scientific areas, like developing vaccines, informing public health policy and strategy and so on. But similarly, you know, a kind of critique of experts and expertise. And this is a kind of broader issue. You'll notice, of course, that these areas are interconnected and inform one another. So linked to that, of course, is the issue around students. So we've had a shift for a while with student as customer, and what that means about the way they engage and what their expectations are of the university. But also through the pandemic, particularly a focus on, you know, needing to shift the way we deliver our provision, and what that means going forward too. So we have essentially many institutions finding at the moment that there's an expectation for sort of hybrid forms of delivery now, which may not have been there before, and which will pose kind of real questions and issues, I think, for organizations going forward. And then around what that means for staff, both in their well-being as well, but also in the diversity of roles and expertise that need to be represented across the sector and that play a part in running, you know, these large, complex organizations. Go to the next slide, Doug. Thanks. So this quote, we've just got a couple of them here to sort of illustrate the kinds of things people were saying. So this is from one of the senior executive roundtables, talking about volatility, saying really demands a different kind of leadership, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. We notice the cracks and strengths that pre-existed have been thrown into sharper relief. And it's exposed things that were already there, but really this focus on what that means then for going to the next stage, what it means for higher education going forward. And this got a point really, again, pointed out by Regina and Lee, about what does that mean about the kinds of leadership, both this balance between compassion and kindness and empathy, alongside many of the other aspects around speed and effectiveness and performance and so on. So, this was sort of key issue, and this is kind of illustrated on this next slide, really around kind of this sense that large scales of change going on, sort of increasing commercialization, increasing kind of workloads, scrutiny, metrics and so on, expectations, a real force. Regina spoke very powerfully to this around, one of the things that, again, also exposed in the pandemic around inequality, around race and other forms of diversity, and really a kind of absolute pressing urgency for universities to for once and for all, seriously begin to tackle and unpick these issues. And likewise, sort of, erosion of trust, erosion of sense of community, challenges in long-term planning and when we're in crisis management, and the shifting perceptions on what higher education is for and the purposes of it. And an interesting point in here, we've got a point here on kind of decreasing investment in IT infrastructure. It's not so much people paying less, but I think the gap between the underinvestment in our IT infrastructure and what's increasingly required vis-a-vis the formal estate and the physical infrastructure of the organizations is really causing these issues around tensions. So next slide, please, Doug. So again, I think this has been highlighted already in the comments we've had, really, that what these expose, what the context has exposed, is issues that I think that sat not far below the surface of higher education for many years, but have really kind of come to a head around these questions around social and economic mission, the tensions between competition and collaboration within and between organizations, this desire for autonomy and development, but also seeking control, but again, both within institutions and at political level, the balance between the structures and the processes that we have, and this tension between continuity and change. So what do we need to keep and carry forward, and that continues to drive the ethos of higher education, and what are the aspects that do need to change, and how will that change us going forward? I think opportunist sense here really that the pandemic, whilst of course it's been highly challenging, has also thrown open a series of opportunities, ways of doing things differently, more of a recognition of ability, of the shared and collective nature of leadership, the importance of inclusive and diverse leadership, and a wider range of areas which leadership may contribute to society. But this is kind of the landscape, the shifting landscape in which we're playing out. Next slide, please, Doug. So I've just got one more quote. This kind of again points to the point very much made by Lee, really, about juggling these tensions. So what we see is this need to be agile and really responding to what's happening right now, but at the same time looking ahead. At the same time, having the emotional intelligence, Regina mentioned that, to deal with not only their student populations and their changing needs and expectations, but also our staff and shifting forms of pedagogy. And what that throws into contrast really is issues around, there's a number of really significant questions around what do our leaders need to do, who they need to be, how do they act, and so on, and what sorts of skills and competencies and qualities. So it seems actually that this work is particularly timely at the moment, really, for the sector, and I think going forward will be really important in shaping the ways we think about what we expect and what we aspire for within higher education leadership. Next slide, Doug. So I'm coming towards the end of sort of the review of the stuff on context. We covered it fairly quickly, as we'll do in this session. There'll be far more to follow later as we report, but I'd be interested in sort of the extent to which what I've described sort of resonates with your own experience. So if we go to the next slide, you can begin sort of voting again at the same place as before. So this idea around those pressures, the complexities, those issues, I'll give you a moment to say to what extent to which that kind of sounds like, familiar or different from the environment in which you're operating. With all of these questions, when we go through them as well, we've got quite a number of closed response questions. Please do feel free to add additional comments in the chat as we go through, so we can have a discussion there. That we may not be able to comment on everything, but we will be able to pick up on those and use them as well. So any particular reflections, but clearly a strong sense that this is a reasonably shared experience. And I think what struck us through the roundtables was the degree to which these issues played out, across those different areas, many of the countries, the different parts of higher education sector, the different kinds of institutions, and across the different populations that we were working with as well. So we found that many of the same issues were being picked up on by early career academics, alongside senior executives, alongside professional managers, and so on. So thank you. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Doug. So the next question, I've got 3 of them. So this one draws on the first slide that I shared really with you around these key drivers. Now, of course, the inevitability is there's not just one driver, but if you were thinking of, at the moment, what is the most significant driver and force impacting the ways in which we go about addressing leadership and change in your organization, please do pick the number one driver of these factors in your organization. So quite a few voting for funding, a fair amount of focus on the political context, student expectations as well. This is interesting. This is slightly different from the spread that we had when we did this with the first group earlier in the week, where I think the strongest sense there was really around the student expectation and impact, and quite a lot around the politics. Funding slightly less so in that group. So this is quite interesting. You seem to have a kind of almost a three-way split across those areas. And interestingly, again, relatively little on the pandemic here. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, please, Doug. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is a framework based on the work of Professor Ralph Stacey. And this really kind of differentiates between the kinds of problems and challenges that we try to deal with as leaders, between those along the bottom axes around the question of, so what is the issue? What are we trying to deal with? Is there a lot of certainty around what it is or far from certainty? And then up the vertical axis around the degree of agreement between people about how best to deal with and respond to that. So far from high levels of agreement to far from agreement. So Doug, if we can go to the next slide. So on here, you have the opportunity to drop a pin on the area of this that you think kind of best characterizes where you find yourself operating a lot of the time in terms of the kinds of leadership challenges and issues that you're facing in your work. So just give that a moment. Meantime, just great to see sort of some comments coming in on the chat as well. We will pick up on these in the Q&A session towards the end as far as possible where we can. And also, you know, they will inform, you know, as part of this is an engagement, inform the things we look for as we go forward. So I guess, you know, quite, again, perhaps not entirely surprising, but really reflecting this point around complexity and as kind of the fundamental characteristic of the environment in which we're operating. You know, varying from sort of complicated, some people I think finding themselves in within or on the edge of anarchy or chaos. Very well, nobody sort of saying it's a sort of simple, straightforward issues. And I think that poses real significant issues around the ways in which we lead through that, you know, from what kind of, whether it's a directive and control or some other way of working. So at that point, I shall pass on to Richard to talk us through the next part of the findings.
That's great. Thanks, Richard. And Doug, if we can have pass this slide into the guts of what we're going to be talking about. Yeah, so thanks, colleagues. Lovely to be speaking with you all today. And what you'll find between the three strands of what Richard, myself and Catherine and I are talking about is significant kind of intersection between how context plays into values and purpose, and therefore from what values and purpose and context we know, how that shapes ideas around competencies and skills for future leadership. What I want to talk about specifically is values and purpose, as have emerged as key parts of our discussion from the roundtable, and obviously has emerged from our literature review. I think that the key themes that did emerge from the roundtables themselves and informed our discussion were around, well, what constitutes the core value of higher education, which I'll get onto briefly, how values of higher education are contested, how they're challenged and how they're shaped, and how that informs what we understand as the purpose of leadership within higher education, a split between what we understand as actualized leadership and what we might hold as aspirations for leadership and its particular focuses within institutional contexts, what challenges exist, of course, of which there are many for higher education leadership, and thereafter what strategies we might be able to think of and design for leadership, particularly leadership which we might categorize and distinguish for being values-based. Next slide, please. So we begin before looking at values and purpose specific to HE leadership to understand what we identify as core values of higher education itself. And I suppose a lot of this centers in and focuses upon the age-old dynamic and bifurcation between higher education as a private gain enjoyed by many, especially in marketized contexts who are there as part of its consumption, or higher education more broadly understood as a public good. But some of the key core values that underpin that and what we aspire to be in the core values of higher education is a space where we have freedom of speech, where we practice inclusivity, where social justice and social mobility are also manifest and also aspired towards. So if we see those as the underpinning values of higher education, we find, if we can get to the next slide, please, Doug, other values as connect specifically to leadership, but how values are particularly challenged. And I think, as Richard's already alluded to, we see much in the way of an external environment impacting upon the kinds of values that might lead towards notions of inclusivity, social justice, and the like. So we see, for instance, the external policy-based background and the politicization of higher education. We see pressures that come from market and business pressures, financial imperatives, which are often seen within institutions to trump, to substitute and replace ethical and moral values. We also see some interesting stuff related to how students as potential consumers, or as recognized as consumers within marketized contexts, are also desirous of non-market-based or non-private-based benefits, which I suppose connect more towards a holistic version of the university as a public institution servicing the public good. But values also being challenged in the context of them being not particularly transparent, not particularly well understood, but also not being particularly well articulated. We see in the context of a discourse of continuing crisis of higher education and continuing transformation of higher education, a sense that the role of senior leadership, specifically in guiding institutions, has changed. And we see again that movement from across the kind of typical traditional notion of the public good university to one which is more focused on private gain. We also, and I think this has been especially apparent in the course of the last 2 years of pandemic, where we've moved more towards crisis management modes, and a greater embrace in terms of digital technologies to undertake institutional governance, a greater embrace of datafication, which I suppose runs and coincides with what many critics of higher education see as the prevalence and proliferation of surveillance and audit cultures. And also much to do with thinking through public higher education in the context of a prestige economy. Finally, values that we might aspire to being challenged by the valorization of negative character traits in university that are often too often can be seen as being rewarded and incentivized. And we can think here in terms of narcissism, ego, arrogance, etc., etc. So a range of ways with which values were seen across the 11 roundtable events to be challenged within HE. Next slide, please. So we asked many of our roundtable participants to really focus on what they saw as the purpose of leadership within higher education context. And here we have a variety of different kinds of stated purposes. We see some of these in the context of overall kind of empowerment of staff and institutional communities, of producing inclusive communities, harmonized inclusive communities, leadership guiding and ensuring the well-being of students and staff, but also the resilience of staff in the face where their well-being may be challenged, threatened, compromised. Leadership directed towards building and maintaining a talent pipeline, and I think it was very much a case of not just thinking of that in the context of student base and graduate talent, but also in terms of the cultivation of staff within institutions. And much was made, especially in terms of the cultivation and nurturing of next generations of academics. Leadership also in terms of articulating a vision, and I think this responds to the previous slide where we found one of the challenges to be the lack of a clear articulation of vision. So the purpose of leadership there in terms of articulating a clear vision and also translating that, implementing that, bringing it to life. And finally, this occurred throughout most of the roundtable events, this notion of leaders as role models, as setting the tone. Next slide, please, Doug. So while we might have all these aspirations and ideals of leadership, we see the challenges. What do we see as being front of mind of many leaders? Well, perhaps regrettably, a reductionist kind of approach here in terms of thinking of leadership being obsessed with or fixated upon income generation, brand management, and strategic positioning. So real bifurcations there. Okay, so what should leaders be focused on? Well, again, we get some kind of repetition here or confirmation of the kind of core themes. Again, much is made here of leaders focusing on student and staff well-being. A notion also around more democratic forms of governance, bottom-up forms of community making where staff are engaged and are involved in the translation of strategy. Leaders very much as being positioned as speaking truth to power and holding power to account, especially in relation to an external hostile policy environment, and advocacy for higher education, making the case for higher education where there may be many detractors out there. Breaking also with narrow definitions of excellence and this compulsion to kind of, especially in what many people refer to as a kind of metricized academy and a metricized approach to understanding the contribution of what universities and academics provide, breaking with these narrow and reductionist definitions of excellence. A major focus, again, advanced by the last 2 years in terms of thinking through the role of leadership in a digital context, in the context of digital disruption, and a need for greater investment in terms of digital literacy and leaders who are able to steward their institutions through the disruptions caused by technological innovation and increased reliance on digital platforms especially. Finally, what should leaders not be focused on? Well, perhaps less of the kind of legacy projects and vanity projects that have seen to be significantly critiqued within an academic trade press and critical literature especially. What are the challenges then? Further challenges for values-based leadership as exist externally? Well, we've got this hyper-competitive higher education environment that we see, especially in the highly neoliberalized higher education contexts. We've got a government policy about higher education, which is driving an increasingly instrumentalist approach and may be accused of causing universities to behave in risk-averse and self-censoring ways. We've got that innate tension between the internal priorities that universities seek to see through on versus the external directives, pressures, regulations, commercial imperatives, and the like that can tend to move leadership away from the aspiration of a bottom-up approach to more of a kind of top-down approach of governance. Other challenges, well, who do we think of in terms of the communities that leadership serve? Are we talking about staff or our students internally or externally? Are we thinking of leadership as serving employers and government? We found within the roundtables other competing notions of value informed by who we think of as leadership and who it serves, again, in the context of students, employers, governments, and other academics. Finally, thinking through in the context of the pandemic over the last 2 years, the extent to which crisis management has potentially blinded or reduced notions of leadership and caused, if we like, a kind of myopia to external threats and the threat of, particularly to institutional autonomy. Next slide, please, Doug. Okay, so if we've looked at the challenges to value-based leadership external, what have we got internally? And I think we see further repetition of themes here in the context of EDI concerns, particularly around agenda bias. We see issues and concerns related to governance structures that are perhaps too complex and not particularly well understood and not sufficiently transparent. We see an association of burden as factored in terms of the taking up of leadership positions and an active policy amongst some of avoidance of those leadership positions as an encumbrance, particularly on career development and progression. We see issues also identified in the context of leadership roles being rotational, and that being both a good and a bad thing, but recognized perhaps more as a challenge where you might have internal networks, internal intelligences being lost. We see also a challenge, and I think this is already mentioned, especially by Lee, that kind of the conflict, and maybe it's an exaggerated conflict that is seen to exist between academic staff and leadership, where leadership within universities, certainly senior leadership and management particularly, are seen to carry the brunt of all our dissatisfaction. And at the same time, balancing the external challenges with the internal needs and maintaining some kind of moral stewardship for institutions. Next slide, please, Doug. Okay, so what are some of the strategies that were opined by our roundtable participants? Well, the first, as you might anticipate, in terms of moving towards a more kind of democratic and inclusive form of institutional governance, was that underpinned by a consultative and collaborative approach, bringing others into a conversation, letting them help to define and determine what it means to lead and to manage in the context with which we've described that's hyper-competitive, which suffers from political hostility, et cetera, et cetera. The staff should be directly involved also in terms of the embodiment of leadership, in terms of recruiting leadership, in terms of ensuring match and alignment between an institutional value system and the kinds of individuals that can lead and deliver on those. And finally, whilst identified as sometimes often quite contrived contraptions, that value statements themselves can provide a kind of anchoring and coherence to the ways with which people can think about the kinds of leadership that they want. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here we get into a little bit more of getting you to respond to some of what we've presented and the articulations from our own roundtable participants in terms of thinking through, and again, these could be seen as quite reductionist questions, and challenging, certainly provocative questions at that. What do you think universities and other HE providers should be focused on most? So let's start with that one. And we're going to ask you to use single words or simple phrases to think through what universities and other higher education providers should be focused on most in the current and emerging context. So if you can input here. Okay, education for the common good, citizen and service, quality, integrity. These are all big words that themselves probably need a lot of unpacking. Collaborative working. Okay, return to the common good. Knowledge creation. Student and staff experience. So we're already seeing here complementarity in terms of views with regards to the contextualization of higher education leadership. Let's give it a few more moments for people to upload. Sharing expertise externally. So much here, I think, about transformation, but perhaps also not only transformation, but consolidation. Okay, if we can move on to our second question. If there can indeed be a single priority for higher education leaders, what would that be? Again, if we can limit answers here to single words or simple phrases, that'll be appreciated. So what is the number one priority, if there could be such a thing, for higher education leaders? And we should see the formation of a word cloud here. Okay. Integrity, empowerment. I think we're seeing much in the kind of way reinforcement of the views that were provided from the original roundtable participants. Climate fairness, innovation. Okay, criticality, empathy. These are all ringing true. Okay, let's give it a few more seconds to see if that word cloud develops all the more. This is very positive. I think it reconfirms a lot of what we've already found within the roundtable. So this is very helpful for us. Okay, Doug, if we can move on to our final question. Okay, so we've asked you to think about what the number one priorities might be for higher education leaders. What's the number one challenge for higher education leaders in the context of what we've just suggested? So the number one challenge for higher education leaders, single words. Government. Yeah, so I think we're getting echoes here in terms of the challenges specifically of the external environment and how that's impacting upon the organization of leadership within institutions. Policy, funding. So we're seeing the threading together of these themes across context and values and purpose. Distrust. Meddling. Infighting fatigue. Yeah. Okay, we'll give a few more moments just for others to upload to the word cloud. Exhaustion. I'm sure that's something that many of us can reflect upon given the extent of work intensification, especially over the course of the pandemic. Bureaucracy. Identity. Okay. Thank you. If we can call it there. And I'm delighted to pass over now to Catherine, who's going to take us through to the last section here in terms of thinking through skills and competencies of higher education leaders. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. Doug, if you go to the next slide. So the final section of the focus groups was asking people to think about the future leadership skills, competencies, or behaviours that they believe are required, both kind of within their own organisation, but also in the wider sector. Next slide, please, Doug. But actually, the first thing that I've put on this slide is actually these things that came up in the conversation about values. Unsurprisingly, these skills and competencies were kind of drip thread throughout the conversations about what was needed in leadership in higher education. And these particular aspects came out a lot in the values conversation that Richard was just talking about. So having a human-centered approach was a large theme across, and I'll come on to that in a second. But that kind of person-centered approach and the need to help people through uncertainty, anxiety, and to support people was an incredibly strong theme across the discussions. And we had a lot of really compelling examples of both where this had and hadn't been done via leadership in higher education. Decision making was also important, and it was interesting to see conversations that kind of showed skills around management, but also around leadership and the kind of competition and tension between those two styles of leadership. Intellectual leadership in pursuing boundaries and driving innovation. Self-reflection also coming out as being really important, as well as having vision, but also this idea of kind of quiet leadership and having a department which is able to function with or without the leader, because the leadership has been so strong up to that point. Next slide, please. So when we initially kind of put these things together, we kind of listed the words that people were using to describe the skills and competency that they thought that leaders should hold. And this led to us kind of summarising and creating a number of qualities that were the kind of key themes that were coming up in the values that and the skills that the focus groups were coming up with. We initially thought that this would actually be the easiest thing to kind of summarize and to put into things, because it was essentially a list of different skills and competencies. However, as I'll come on to in a minute, it's actually slightly more complicated than we originally anticipated. So Doug, if you could go through the different skills that we came up with. So being collaborative was really important, being decisive, adaptable. Compassionate was a really big one, and like I said, formed a lot of the discussion around skills and competencies, and you can see on the screen a lot of the words there were around that particular theme. Being inclusive, analytical, self-reflective was an interesting and important one. A lot of people talking about that kind of need to be having their own professional development alongside being able to reflect on the team. Being authentic, creative, and I see some of the people in the chat putting creativity as being important, so fitting into there. Digitally engaged, and finally being credible. So we looked at all of these things, and this is where it started to get a bit more complicated in our discussions when we were talking through how this all fits together, because actually it's not a case of that these are even individual characteristics or something that one person should hold, and it's not necessarily the case that a good leader would hold all of these things at a high level. So we decided to kind of think of this in terms of a leadership culture and think of these as leadership qualities. If you go to the next slide, Doug. So the idea that all of these fit together in a sort of qualities of a leader, which is embedded in the team, which is embedded in the culture, which is embedded in the wider culture of the university. So if we go to the next slide. A quick question on those then. So you should have got the question up on your screen shortly. Which three do you believe are the most important leadership qualities in higher education? Okay, so this is quite different again to what we found yesterday, I think, with a lot of people saying collaborative being the most important there. Authenticity, that fits with our the word cloud that Richard just pulled up, which sort of had that integrity there as being really important. So a mix there really across the different the different qualities, but you seem to be favouring the authentic, collaborative and credible approaches there. So interesting to see. Next slide, please. So when we started talking about this, we actually realised that this is much more complicated than just pulling out a few traits or qualities that leaders hold and kind of being able to suggest that this is what a leader should do, because actually this sits within all the conversation that we've been having this afternoon. These are just a small part of the wider context of leadership in higher education. And actually, we have the individual leader who will hold these individual qualities, but this happens within a team, which happens in the department, and the complexity goes out, and all of these different factors will impact how the leader reacts and deals with the situation, and how they harness those leadership qualities in different situations and in different contexts within the higher education environment. So we wanted to show that actually, even though these qualities were what our focus groups viewed as important, actually a lot of the examples that our participants were giving were very much about the leadership culture, and not necessarily about a trait that one particular individual held, but actually the kind of environment that leadership was taking place in. And a lot of these discussions didn't happen without acknowledgement of the culture that those actions were happening in. So next slide, please. So we'd like to get your opinions on kind of where you think the most important factors lie in leadership. So I appreciate that this is a difficult question to answer, and perhaps again, there's obviously no right or wrong answer here, but at what level do you think good leadership is most important? I'm not seeing anything coming up there, Doug. Is that?
I think it's a ranking exercise, so it just takes a moment or two longer.
That makes sense. There we go. Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. So I know that these are still coming in, but really interesting to see that actually kind of supporting what I just said about the complexity of it. Actually, that individual level isn't viewed as so important as actually what's going on at the institution, which you're suggesting is the most important area for good leadership. And then the kind of smaller levels of the team and the department, with the sector being perhaps the least important, but the individual not far behind that. So interesting to see your thoughts there. Next question, please, Doug. And then next question, reflecting on that then. So at what level do you think that there's the greatest need for leadership development? Okay, interesting about the institution perhaps being the most important area that we need leadership development, the sector being the least important area, and then the department and the team in the middle again. So reflecting a similar structure to before in the importance of what makes a good leader, or where good leadership sits, and then the need for leadership development. So interesting, and I know that there's been a lot of conversation going on in the chat as we've been going through today, so I'm really looking forward to now the chance to having a conversation about this and some of the findings, and getting your opinions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Catherine, Richard, and Richard for taking us through that fairly sort of high-level summary of the emerging findings from the scoping study so far. And thank you to everyone in the session for your interaction with the live polls. As I say, a little bit of childish delight in seeing the responses, but also, you know, as a snapshot of thinking, reflections, and valuing around leadership, very interesting to see as well. So, as well as advancing the slides and running the polls, I've also been scanning the chat for some of your questions and inquiries and comments. So I'm just going to pull a few of those into a little bit of conversation now with the team. So I'm going to stop sharing for this just to help with the engagement. So I'm going to begin with a reflection from Leah Blage Ward. Great to have you on the call, Leah. And I'll point this one to Richard Bolden, and it's just a reflection around how the drivers of leadership may vary with types of leadership role, I guess, within the institution. Richard.
Yes, no, I mean, I think it's a really important point. I guess, you know, within the time available within this presentation, of course, we've looked at kind of commonalities and consistencies across the populations as a whole, rather than focusing in on a great deal of different attention around differences between roles and institutions and locations. So I guess, you know, it's partly a consequence of the format in which we're currently presenting back. I guess another point though was to say that we were struck and by the similarities in issues that were brought out between the 11 different round tables. So I guess, you know, I think I meant to mention it earlier, but, you know, we was a little bit, you know, interested to see that even early career researchers and people in different areas, of course, there was a slightly different kind of lens as to how significant. So I guess, you know, things like funding may have been more significant to those with more formal managerial type roles on behalf of the institution. But of course, you know, this is something that we will seek to pick out a bit more from the roundtables and the discussions. But if you remember that, of course, the aim of this piece of work is to act as a scoping study that then enables us to design an instrument that can go out much more widely. So it will probably be not until we get to analysing the responses to the wider Advanced HE survey that we'll really be able to bring out in a very meaningful way the differences between those different populations. Because at the moment, I guess, you know, the sample sizes are still too small within the groups, and to say a colossal amount of, you know, with certainty about the different, you know, relative differences between those groups. I hope that's
great, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you. And you're right to highlight that the scoping study feeds into the survey, which will generate another larger data set in itself. Clearly, the scoping study is looking to come up with a survey structure that serves all of these purposes that some of your questions are highlighting. There's a very similar question. I think that's from Steve Outram. Great to have you on the call as well, Steve, asking if there are many differences or similarities across mission groups. I guess, Richard, it's a similar response to that one.
I guess, yeah, the answer to that is saying we don't really have enough large enough populations to really comment in detail on that. And of course, bearing in mind that they were kind of global groups as well. So of course, how those mission groups are constructed is going to be different in the UK as it is going to be from other regions. I guess, you know, the point, of course, there will of course be differences. So, you know, context is interesting, that in a way context affects everybody, but how you experience it is very much, you know, kind of unique to where you happen to sit. What is your role within, what kind of organization within, which discipline, subject area. And it's those nuances, so recognition that there's a bigger context, but how that plays out and how we experience that is very different. And I think, I guess, you know, the key point here is not for us to try and come up with a definitive categorization of contexts of higher education, but to draw out from that, saying what kinds of context is this? What does that mean, therefore, about the leadership competencies and qualities that we require and that we need to develop? And I think that's maybe a slightly different kind of question in that we can't do the contextualization themselves. So inevitably differences, Steve, but I think we probably, you know, can't go an awful lot different than I'm sure you probably already have a sense as to what might be the differences between those types of organizations.
Thank you again, Richard. And yes, I remember that on one occasion we had 2 roundtables on the same day, one early morning, one later in the afternoon UK time. And one of those conversations was a senior leadership group, or drawn from senior leadership groups. And if I remember rightly, the other was the group of early career academics. And I remember reflections after facilitating those two were regarding the strong similarity of the issues arising, and also the quality of the conversation. Okay, I'm going to move to another question. I'll point this one to Richard Watermeyer, if I may, and an observation from Stuart Hunter. Great to have you on the call, Stuart. And this is to do with the issue of conflicting values, particularly looking at those sort of guiding principles of organizations and the difference between the espoused values and the lived values as it were.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I think this is the terrain where we get into emperor's new clothes, where we purport certain things, but actually the substance behind them just isn't there. And I think there was probably quite a lot, and this is a bit of a follow-on to the response Richard just provided, in terms of, whilst there may be variation in terms of the experience of leadership and experience of these kinds of devices that tell one story that may be very differently experienced on the ground level, and which I think exacerbate the kind of sense of division between a kind of rank and file of academic communities and leaders. I think the thing that really struck me throughout the course of the roundtables was the extent of complementarity between the groups, in terms of the extent to which there was a kind of a candidness around the experience of such things, and yeah, no, I think that's where as much as I can really say on that, in terms of the experience of leadership, the experience of the different kinds of devices of leadership, and the different technologies that are being employed within universities, being, whilst individually experienced, being shared, and I think there being something of a kind of a concern with regards to the truth, the reality versus the marketized version of it, should we say? I'm not sure if that really answers the question. I think I'm afraid I was getting myself in knots.
No problem, Richard. You know, any discourse around this is by its very nature very dialogic, isn't it? One thought leads to the next, and I certainly reflect on some of the roundtables that I discuss, that I observed the discussion as regards organizational values being helpful strategically, and other comments regarding values in more of a sort of community building and engagement capacity, and the real difficulty of having them operate in both ways, I guess, came through. Something just to point towards Catherine, if I may, and this has come out really through a couple of observations in the chat, and is to do with perhaps a little bit of a sense of paradox in leadership, Catherine, between the sort of the collaborative culture that you referred to, with those lovely circles spiraling out, as it were, and the role of the individual leader in enabling that sense of social identity, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely don't think it's the case of, or if I be a bit more analytical, my team will function better and I'll be a bit better leader. I think it's about, you know, how this all fits together. And I think that diagram at the end quite nicely kind of brings that all together, and any framework that Advanced HE kind of comes up with, I think, needs to take that complexity into consideration. So we're not just going away and telling people, if you're a bit more digitally engaged, you'll be a better leader. It's so much more complicated than that, and it all sits within this big complex context, which really needs to be acknowledged. And I think as an individual leader, having a good awareness of that is probably the best place to start. Actually, what are the factors that are impacting me within this context, within my sector, within my team, within my department? How does that impact me in these particular qualities that I have? And therefore, what's the kind of the longer term impact on my own leadership and my own team? So I think it's, you know, it's that complex structure that's really important to think about, and a paradox is a good way to describe it. Yeah,
absolutely. And that notion within a more distributed model of leaders as enablers of leadership, rather than attempting to hold leadership closely, I guess. Another question, observation coming from Carl Leidecker. Great to have you again on the call, Carl. Coming back to Richard Bolden, and this is a question about the degree to which mission and strategy operates as a driver of leadership. And I know our main focus was on external drivers, but in the conversations, the degree to which explicit strategy, I suppose, was recognized as a driver of leadership.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I answered briefly in the chat, but of course, I think the point really is that, of course, mission and purpose is a key driver. And of course, well, when you do work like this, you fundamentally always get back to the question, so what is the purpose of higher education, as Richard kind of illustrated in his talk? And certainly one of the things we see through the pandemic and in recent years anyway, I think, is an increasing kind of plurality and diversification of the expectations and requirements of what institutions are thought of. So I think the challenge that universities have vis-a-vis certain other industries, if you want to use that term, is they don't have a single purpose. They don't have a single set of core stakeholders. So, whilst of course our student body is a key stakeholder group and a key driver, in reality, for pretty much all institutions, few exceptions, of course, but for the vast majority of institutions, that, of course, while an absolutely key set of stakeholders you have to keep engaged in, it's not the only part. So certainly if you're an institution that are involved in research, external engagement, impact, trying to play a civic role within the lives of their wider cities and communities, working with business and so on, then those take, some of them, sometimes they're complementarity. Ideally, you can find complementarities to the teaching and the student demands. But I guess, it's different from, I think one of the differences that makes higher education leadership literature different, for example, from the work on leadership in schools, is particularly this issue around plurality of mission. So, and there's sort of this tension, whereas in schools, I think very few people would argue that, the fundamental purpose of schools is around pupil and learner experience and outcomes. But in higher education, that always is done alongside a set of other things. And back to the context, of course, how significantly each of those drivers is felt depends really on where you sit within the organization and what roles you are, but also plays out often for individuals as feeling like you're really torn and in opposing ways of being needing to be seen to do everything simultaneously very well, which of course is not always easy, and certainly is one of the things that impacts on mental health and well-being of staff and others as well. I hope that helps.
Does indeed, Richard. And yes, one of the features of higher education and academic leadership, that success is very multidimensional, and that elusive strategic challenge or quest to identify those things that transcend our differences as we try to achieve on those multiple fronts. Okay, I'm just going to pass a reflection to you, Richard Watermeyer from Tamer, who likes the co-location moral stewardship.
Yeah, indeed. I'm not quite sure how easily I can provide any further kind of reflection or observation on that. But I think it was one of those things that did challenge. How can we do, for instance, ethically based leadership? How can we ensure that an ethics of care in our leadership is central to how we do leadership within universities, where that can be seen to be too often compromised or challenged by a variety of different pressures, both external, as we've discussed and presented, and as espoused by many of our roundtable participants, that are both internal, but also the external context. How do we maintain compassion? How do we maintain empathy? These can be often aspirational qualities that often too easily get missed when we're confronted with the bottom line, external commercial imperatives, a need to be accountable to both policy and public stakeholder communities and the like. So yeah, it's the challenge, I think, in terms of any kind of imagining or reimagining of what leadership can be, both in the context, I think, of the pandemic, but also moving towards a kind of post-pandemic, dare I say, if we ever get to that point, higher education landscape and environment where we can think about more easily, perhaps, think about how we go about those compassionate forms of leadership, where values-based on our values and the front and center of how we think about leadership, which, of course, regrettably, and too often are contested and said to be not, and said to be submerged or else not present. So I think a lot of what came through from the roundtable discussions was one about, well, how can we actually platform these? How can we protect these? How can we ensure that there's custodianship within leadership? There's the double leadership, if you like, of those core values, and ensure that we do a better kind of moral accountability.
Yes, and I guess the moral perspective has come out strongly through the pandemic experience, or the need to really crystallize that. And I was struck by another comment from Esther Brown in the chat, Richard, which was to do with a safe to fail value in the environment.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think that's one of the major challenges that we all face, regardless of where we sit within the higher education system, whether we're academics, whether we are within professional services divisions and the like. It's the extent of the kind of hyper performance culture that's come to dominate higher education, especially in these kind of marketized settings that we have. Our continuous chase for positional goods, right? Whether that be in the form of the acquisition of capital through money or funding, or in the context of performance-based claims and league tables, which really prevents us from doing some of the more kind of experimental, innovative type work, right? Because there is that constant risk of failure. So how do we think about leadership in ways that actually celebrates the opportunities that comes with failure? So yeah, thanks, Esther, for that one. I completely agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's probably one of the major challenges, again, when we think about bottom line, when we think about the way with which so much of how our higher education is organized into key performance indicators or productive measures and positional gains, productive goods, the list goes on. So how do we move towards a territory where we can have leadership that is allowed to allow its communities to embrace those failures?
Absolutely. And I guess there's a segue across to having a forgiving space for some of the sort of cherished values around academic freedom and individual intellectual pursuit. And I noticed Regina's commented very interesting provocation in the chat about whether compassionate leadership would have featured as highly pre-pandemic, which is very interesting. I'm going to finish with one last question, which is similar to one we had yesterday. And this is from Sharon Hutley. Again, great to have you on the call, Sharon, which is asking about casting an eye across to other sectors in terms of the discussion of leadership, and particularly how the pandemic experience has either seen synergies with leadership in other sectors or key differences, I guess. And I'll come to Richard Bolton for that one.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's an awful lot we can learn from looking elsewhere. Unfortunately, within the scope of this piece of work, we've only really been able to focus within higher education. I mean, we will be, as we move forward with this, looking at work that does draw on insights from other sectors. So last time I mentioned there was a recent piece of work by PwC, the large consultancy firm, looking at the impact of the pandemic on different sectors. And interestingly, higher education was ranked as the second highest, most impacted sector, just behind hospitality and leisure, which was quite interesting in terms of the impact. Of course, how that's experienced and how that's responded to is going to be different. I think there are particular skills and competencies amongst those that have been identified where we really can look to other sectors. So around the work with digital, for example, around crisis management and decisiveness. But I guess, you know, ultimately the question, this will be a key part of the survey, will be to identify also what's unique and distinct about higher education, and, you know, maybe in a way that other places might look to learn from higher education and what they do, rather than us importing models from elsewhere, because of course we all know the impact of, you know, for example, workload models, which are now endemic across the sector, imported, but actually rarely increasingly being used in commercial organizations, but actually, you know, really shaping how, yeah, not always in good ways, what happens in universities. So I think we do look elsewhere. Certainly I've done a lot of work in healthcare and we draw insights from there. I think the point about compassion is interesting. I think the challenge, if you take compassion in healthcare, where it has been talked about pre-pandemic, is the real challenges on people being able to be compassionate in terms of the system and the environment in which they operate. So, you know, we place incredibly difficult demands on people. And this is about, to the point Catherine made about levels. So, you know, often it's when we individualize a need for compassion, we expect leaders to be individually compassionate, although many examples of organizations that are not compassionate to how they work with their staff and their students. And so this is the bigger kind of wider conversation. So certainly it's something we will reflect on, but actually the key focus of this piece of work is around higher education, with the aim of developing the survey for the sector. And once that's of course in place and we have data, then it enables us to begin to compare more systematically, maybe with other sectors. Maybe hopefully other people will replicate and do similar, you know, comparable pieces of work in other parts of the other industries.
Mm. Thank you, Richard. And I noticed a comment again from Stuart Hunt relating to the point you're making on compassion fatigue, I suppose, is with regard to a phrase Stuart's using called role strain. Listen, thank you so much for all of your questions, comments, observations in the chat, really valuable in itself. And thank you, Richard and Catherine, for your responses in short order to what have been very big questions, actually. It remains for me to draw our session to a close, and I'd like to finish with a piece of text that came through the literature review in terms of good leadership. And what's interesting here is it throws up two senses of the word good. First of all, good in the moral sense, so morally good leadership, and then good in the technical sense of good, effective leadership. And I guess if you can combine the two, being good and effective with being good morally in the context in which you find yourself, that's a fairly strong place to be. An interesting reflection to end there. In terms of the journey, these dissemination engagement events are, as it were, a springboard into the final phase of analysis that will develop that outline survey design for the finalized survey that we will run around about June and July this year. So can I just finish by thanking everyone who's been involved in this session. Thank you very, very much for your time, your commitment, your interest in this incredibly important conversation to do with leadership which sets the emotional tone of the work environment in so many important ways, and that sense of a collective community really engaged in this has been extraordinary throughout. So thank you very, very much for being part of it. Thank you to Richard Bolden, Richard Watermeyer and Catherine Knight for your presentations and also the discussion around questions. Thank you to everyone for being part of the session. Thank you very much. We will close there. Thank you.